let's talk about the Enlightenment or Age of Reason. The two terms are more or less equivalent. It's just that, the French and the Germans and Italians and Spanish and so forth tend to use some form of the term Enlightenment for what happened during this period. In England, the tradition has been to use the term Age of Reason, but it's basically the same general cultural movement. And this movement was signaled particularly by the great advances in the natural sciences in the period that we've been talking about, 16th, 17th, and then on into the 18th centuries, and of course a process that goes on very much in our own time, with the rise of prestige of science as providing a model for how we know what we know. So, let's go back to the PowerPoint, please. So I'd like to reflect a little bit on science and epistemology. Now, epistemology is a fancy word for what? Yeah.
The study of knowledge.
Yeah, the study of knowledge, the study of knowledge. Episteme is one of the Greek words for knowledge. And of course, you know, naturally enough, that L-O-G-Y put on the end of a word typically means the study of, or the organized body of knowledge about. Okay? So epistemology is the study of how we know what we know, and how we know whether what we know is true. Because both of those things are necessary, aren't they? You have to know, first of all, how we know what we know. But then secondly, how do we know whether what we know is true? What kinds of conditions must be met in order for us to certify something that we claim to know as actually true? Okay? Now, science in the 17th century was making amazing advances. I've mentioned Galileo, but there were others, you know, and in your textbook, you know, we've got a listing of quite a number of scientists and scientific achievements taking place during the period. The prestige of science became so important among educated people, at least, that it was a field still open to amateurs or people who were relative amateurs. You had lots of people who had the means to do so going out and buying their own telescopes so they could make observations of the heavens. You had lots of people buying microscopes. It was common to find microscopes in the homes of people who were well enough off to own them, at any rate, in the latter part of the 17th century and throughout the 18th century and beyond, because people would be cultivating a whole new attitude towards knowledge. There's a whole world that we hadn't really understood. And now it appeared that the means to understanding were opening up. A whole enlightenment was taking place in civilization. It was no longer just guesswork. It was no longer just superstition. It was no longer simply somebody claiming to have the authority to tell us what was true or what was not true. We now actually had the means through education to develop a method for arriving at truth and then confirming or disconfirming the results, which is obviously very important. So, philosophically considered, there then were different methods of knowing. Rationalism and empiricism tended to clash in the 17th century. Rationalism, I'm just giving a kind of simplified sketch here because this is not a philosophy course, and you know, it's not necessary for us to go into all of the nuances of these ideas and systems here for our purposes, because what we're talking about is the cultural understanding, the broad cultural understanding of these movements, and therefore the broad cultural influence of these ideas. So rationalism, in general, starts by investigating ideas themselves and the mental processes by which they are produced. And it is therefore primarily deductive, and we associate this in the 17th century, perhaps first and foremost, with Descartes, who examined himself. He said, I want to know how my mind works. And so he began to turn inward and analyze his mental processes according to a very systematic methodology that he developed for doing this. And out of this came things like his famous discourse on method. You know, and you've probably heard, you know, the famous instance in which Descartes said, well, first of all, I want to establish, is there something about which I can be absolutely certain? Something I can know with absolute certainty. And he came up with the conclusion, at least as a starting point, there is one thing, and that is that I am thinking about the problem in the first place. I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I must exist, otherwise I could not be thinking about the question of my existence. Okay, and then of course he proceeds from there. That's simply a very famous line in the history of philosophy as a kind of starting point in his methodological search for how our human mental processes work as we come to acquire genuine knowledge. Empiricism tends to start from the opposite direction. Now, these are not totally at odds with one another, but in general, at least in the 17th century, people tended to think of them in opposition, or at least as very different in their results from one another. Empiricism starts by investigating the world of sense experience, and then studies how we learn the truth about it. And this is primarily inductive, as we say. And the person with whom we associate this most closely is John Locke, the great late 17th century English philosopher and scientist John Locke, whom you may know best as a political philosopher because of his analyses of certain kinds of political problems. Okay, notice now that in empiricism then, we begin with the premise, which is actually very Aristotelian in its origins. We begin with the premise that the ultimate location for knowledge is going to be in sense experience. In sense experience. Now we're talking about scientific knowledge, knowledge of the world, okay? We're not talking about knowledge of God, let's say. But there are those who would say, yeah, but you know, this is at odds with what some people claim to be their knowledge of God. Nevertheless, that's an issue that we'll set aside for the moment. So empiricists start by investigating the world of sense experiences, things that we can observe, or we can construct instruments that do the observing for us. Okay? So that I can't see microbes, but I could construct instruments that can do the seeing of those microbes for me, right? I can't put my hand around your arm and tell you what your blood pressure is, but I can construct a sphygmomanometer, which will be capable of giving me an accurate reading of your blood pressure, both systolic and diastolic, right? So that knowledge will begin either with those things that we can observe or that we can construct instruments to do accurate observations for us. of events occurring in the physical world. But then we study how we learn about those things. So that Locke developed a very elaborate psychology and a very elaborate psychological system for how we take sense experiences and we abstract from them to form ideas, and then we begin to relate one idea to another idea in a hierarchy, a structural hierarchy of such mental operations. So, in empiricism, there are certain tests of truth. And by the way, empiricism is usually referred to as the British philosophy, because in the 17th and 18th centuries, while continental philosophers were tending in a different direction, many of them, in England, much of philosophical as well as scientific thought was dominated by what we even call in the history of philosophy British empiricism. So what are the empirical tests of truth? To be a valid object of empirical knowledge, something must be observable, measurable, and predictable. To be a valid object of empirical knowledge. Now let me just think about that with you for a moment. What would a valid object of empirical knowledge be, and what would something be that was not a valid object of empirical knowledge? I mean, if it has to be observable, measurable, and predictable, things which are not observable, measurable, or predictable are not valid objects of knowledge, at least of empirical knowledge. Let's say I make some claim about the spiritual world, okay, or about the afterlife. Is that observable, measurable, and predictable? Not in our ordinary senses of those terms, at any rate. And so my claims about the spiritual world would presumably be ruled out of bounds by the empiricist. The empiricist might well say, fine, you know, you can hold those beliefs to be true, but you have to hold them to be true on grounds other than empirical tests. Okay? On different grounds. Which goes back to what I was saying in our last segment about how in the later Middle Ages and then the early modern period, there were certain thinkers who began to say, well, there may be two different forms of truth. That science and religion don't have to be seen to be in opposition to one another. There may simply be two different kinds of truth. And two different kinds of faculties for knowing the truth. And that was a debate that continued for a very long time. Okay, so something must be observable, either directly or indirectly. We can't see the things on Mars that we have the rover seeing for us, right? But they are observable. Measurable, we have to be able to measure things. If you can't measure something in terms of its temperature, I mean, how do you know when water boils? I mean, we can see it, of course, but how do you know at what temperature water boils? Well, we have instruments that can accurately measure that and can tell us that the boiling point of water is different in Houston than it is in Denver, right? Because of the different altitudes in the different places which cause different atmospheric pressures and so on, which affect the boiling point of water. I mean, there are lots of things like that. I mentioned a moment ago blood pressure. I mean, if we couldn't accurately measure blood pressure, what use is it to know that there is such a thing? Okay, so measurability becomes essential to this whole scientific method, and predictable. What scientists actually usually call replicable. Can you replicate the experiment? Can you predict the results? Think about this. In medicine, some of you may know this. I don't know if any of you work in hospitals or clinics or doctor's offices or whatever, but if you did, you might run into this. the last stage in the approval by the Food and Drug Administration of a new pharmaceutical is testing what the human body does to the drug. Up to that point, the tests have been on what the drug does to the human body, okay? But clearly, at some point, you have to be able to find out what the drug does, what the human body does to the drug. Otherwise, how can you establish what the dosage is going to be? How long and with what potency does the medication stay in your body? Those things have to be tested. Otherwise, you have no way of telling whether you should give 5 milligrams of this once a day, or 10 milligrams of this twice a day, or whatever it may be, right? Okay, so you have to be able to predict the results. If we give the patient such and such medication at such and such time, under such and such conditions, and then we measure by collecting either samples of the patient's excretions or by blood samples, we measure the levels at which the medication stays in the system. Notice we can predict that the next time the same thing will happen. And that if it happens for X number of patients, it should happen predictably enough for patients generally, unless some other factor intervenes. Okay, so that predictability is absolutely essential to science. Look at those guys in Utah who claim to have achieved cold fusion a few years ago. The problem is that they have not been able to repeat their experiment and come up with that result, nor has anybody else. Nor has anybody else. The point of this is that if I publish my results and I say, okay, if you do the following things, you will get the following result, then anybody in the world who has the same kind of knowledge and expertise and material capacity that I do should be able to perform the same experiment and get the same result. Okay? So, there we are. Empirical truth, therefore, is communal knowledge. It's not just individual knowledge, it is communal knowledge. It must be possible for different persons to study the problem and arrive at the same results, especially through an experimental method, if that's available to us. And what follows from that is, how do we know whether or not scientists agree that something has been established as true? We can only do so through discussion, including disputes, and that discussion, including the disputes about it, must be free from any constraints. In other words, science requires freedom of expression, requires freedom from censorship, requires freedom from constraints of any kind. Because scientists will often disagree, won't they? You know, there are some Finnish scientists who a few years ago claimed that they had discovered yet smaller organisms than anybody previously thought possible. And at first their findings were simply dismissed in the scientific community generally. But now the scientific community is coming around and people are performing similar experiments and beginning to say, you know, those Finnish people were right. They were right. You know, they were onto something. We don't know yet what it is, but we do know now that they were onto something. That would only be possible in an atmosphere of free discussion and free exchange of ideas and information. You can see where this is leading in the late 17th century and on into the 18th century. What else is happening? How do you resolve disputes when they come up? Because disputes are going to come up at different times. How do you resolve disputes? First of all, by following rules for reasonable discourse. Scientists don't just get up, usually anyway, and scream obscenities at one another. Or say, well, I'm not going to accept that because, you know, I think that your mother was a person of low character. Right? There are certain rules for reasonable discourse. If you present a paper in a chemistry course, there are certain rules by which that paper will be judged. If you were a chemist and you were going to present your paper before the American Chemical Society meeting, there would be certain rules of reasonable discourse by which your colleagues would be judging your paper. And something may be accepted as true based on a consensus among persons qualified to make judgments about it. Now notice the two key terms here are consensus and qualification. Consensus and qualification. Science always works by consensus. I mean, it may be that there's a maverick out there who comes up with some new way of looking at things and the rest of the people say, oh, you know, this is crazy. But let's say that eventually they become convinced, the scientific community becomes convinced, well, it was true after all, so we've got to change our thinking now. A new consensus then is arrived at. In medicine, there will be a consensus on how to treat certain kinds of diseases, okay, that will develop within the scientific community. But notice this consensus really has value to the extent that it is arrived at by persons who are qualified to make the judgments. Now, in a free society like ours, every one of us is free to express opinions about anything, right? But how valid are the opinions of the loudmouth at the other end of the bar, who's simply shouting off, you know, what his opinions may be? How credible are my opinions about submicroscopic physics? You know, subatomic physics. I mean, what I know is you know, just tiny, tiny, tiny indeed from hanging around with some of my physicist friends. But, you know, I'm no physicist, so, you know, and if I tell you my opinions about something, what are my opinions worth? Right? So one of the conditions that we include here is that the person have some kind of qualification for making the judgments that he or she does. Okay. Now notice that this will lead towards certain attitudes towards truth, this developing scientific method or attitude. What is accepted as true will always be open to further questioning, analysis, and research. We always know that where we are now is not where we're going to be 10, 20, 50, 100 years from now. And we're making our judgments now based on the best information and analysis we have. But that has to be open to further questioning, analysis, and research. That implies a methodological doubt. Now, methodological doubt is kind of a mouthful to express how, as a matter of method, of scientific method, we always have to be at least a little bit doubtful, a little bit skeptical, even about our own thinking and our own findings, so that we will remain open to further research, our own and or other people's. Now, before we actually get into Bacon, let's shut down the screen just for a moment. Before we get into Bacon, Notice what I've been talking about. The ideal of a new kind of rationality, which would be based on questioning, evidence, observation, measurability, predictability, rational discussion among people who have actually fulfilled those kinds of conditions, rational rules for resolving disputes over what is truth or what is not. Okay? Guess what that becomes a model for in the 17th and 18th centuries? People don't all foresee this. It becomes a model for democracy. It becomes a model for a democracy. A scientific community, ideally, maybe a scientific community doesn't always behave ideally, but a scientific community ideally is an ideal democracy, right? It is a group of fellow citizens who have rational rules for discovering what is true and separating it out from what is false, and who have rational rules for resolving disputes, generally speaking, at any rate. Is that not what a democracy is, ideally at any rate, supposed to be, according to 17th and 18th century thinkers? Right? In which we arrive at a consensus. Isn't that what a democracy is? A group of citizens, through free and open and reasonable discussion, even disputing with one another, ultimately arrive at a consensus determined numerically. Obviously, you have to have some way of determining what the consensus is going to be. And this becomes the principle underlying the whole argument for democracy. Okay? It's very, very interesting how scientific communities, as they are talked about in the 17th and 18th centuries, really translate into models for democratic systems. Okay. Why do you think Jefferson said that everybody should have access to education? And if everybody doesn't have the money to go to school, everybody should have public education that is provided by the polis. Why? Because you cannot have a democracy in any meaningful sense if you don't have an electorate of intelligent and reasonably well-informed people who therefore are capable of arriving at reasonable judgments. Or at least that's the great Jeffersonian hope. So, much of our system is based upon that very conviction. Okay, having said all of this, then, well, let me ask, are there any questions about what I've been saying? Okay, so you have not overnight, and certainly not everybody. You know, of all the millions of people living in Western Europe, and then adding on to them the ones who are now beginning to migrate to the Western Hemisphere, certainly not everybody is thinking the way that I'm talking about now. But it's beginning. It's beginning. And this is something which is going to grow and grow and grow and grow over several centuries. But among certainly educated people, the kinds of things that I've been talking about are becoming increasingly widely accepted. So we turn, for example, to Francis Bacon, who wrote quite a number of essays and longer works, and who is very much not exactly an original thinker, but he is one of those people who is able to give voice to certain kinds of ideas. Certain kinds of ideas. You know, he's a kind of popularizer, and I don't mean that in a bad sense. Popularizers serve a very important function. You know, we have in our time, fortunately, some people who are wonderful writers about science, so that those of us who are not scientists can understand, at least up to a point, a good deal of what's going on among scientists and some of the ideas that they are thinking about. That's the kind of guy that Bacon was. In Of Truth, he turns to the Bible. And remember the famous story in the Bible about Pilate, who finally, according to the biblical narrative, when he's questioning Jesus, can't really find anything wrong with Jesus, certainly can't find any evidence or testimony to condemn him of the crime with which he had been accused. And so he is reported, and of course this comes down in legend to us, he is reported then to have said, "What is truth?" washed his hands of the whole affair, and walked away. Well, okay, so Bacon uses that story to begin his argument. He rejects those like Pilate who would be universally skeptical at arriving at truth. But how do we know what is true? Or how do we know when we have arrived at the truth? He notes the tendency of most people to accept pleasant or beautiful lies or half-truths. Bacon again and again is going to say, you know, we have that desire for certainty which leads us into accepting things as true which may not be true, or they're only half true, because we desperately want to believe in certain things as true, because we want to be certain. We don't want to live in a world of uncertainties. Interesting. It's an idea which is going to come up again and again and again, especially in the 19th century. His analogy with the process of God's creation suggests that knowledge begins with sense knowledge. I mean, that's the way he develops his argument. So that while he is not himself an empirical philosopher, notice that what he is saying is really popularizing certain notions that were being discussed among the empirical philosophers and scientists. He also wrote a work which we have in our text called Of Superstition. Of Superstition. He's not attacking religion, by the way. He's not attacking religion. What he attacks is what he calls superstition in religion. Okay? And he says that really does more harm to the state than atheism does. I mean, this is a very bold argument. You can imagine how this went over in the 17th century. You can imagine how it would go over nowadays. Atheism does no harm to the state. Why? Because the atheist is attempting to be a rational person, and generally speaking, really tries to be a virtuous person, and therefore is no harm to the state. Whereas the religious fanatic can endanger the state and civil order. And again, go back to what was happening in the 16th and 17th centuries. Not everybody, to be sure, but there were some people who were true religious fanatics who were trying to burn other people, and sometimes were burning other people at the stake, and doing horrible, horrible atrocities in the name of religion. And again, I'm not attacking religion here, nor was Bacon. The danger of following certain traditions when they promote superstition rather than truth is, first of all, the power of tradition over us, but then secondly, we have to be able to question things even if they are part of our conventional wisdom and part of what has traditionally been accepted. we constantly have to question. But he also is deeply suspicious of going to another extreme when some democratic notion of the people as the source of reform is being argued for, which of course is what the Puritans were doing. Bacon was no Puritan in the early 17th century. The Puritans who would eventually, in the Civil War, take over the government. Another one of his works, The Abuses of Language, asserts that the revival of learning is good. The revival of learning in the Renaissance, going back not simply to classical works, but also to the whole concept of our reviving learning. That is itself extremely important. But the excessive emulation or following of classical rhetoricians has led to an excessive value being placed on eloquence for its own sake. On eloquence for its own sake. And this is the old argument of Socrates in Plato's dialogues, especially the Gorgias. What do you do when you prize the eloquence of eloquent speakers so much that you prize their eloquence more than you do the truth of the matter? Socrates was arguing against people who were teachers of persuasiveness, of argumentation, of eloquence, the rhetoricians, who didn't care what was true or what was false, according to Socrates at any rate. They cared only how to make the most eloquent argument for whatever you wanted to argue for. Okay? And that is, in effect, confusing an image of reality with the reality itself. Trying to construct things in language in such a way that they become so attractive and so persuasive that we get confused and think that that is the reality when it is not. Yeah, you have a question? Oh, could we have the slide back up again? Thank you. What he calls Pygmalion's frenzy. Remember the story of Pygmalion, you know, who creates a sculpture of the most beautiful woman, and of course then he goes into this frenzy because he wants to possess this woman. But the woman is a statue. This is his Galatea. Okay, but of course, here's Bacon. He's a child of the Renaissance, so of course he's going back to classical literature and classical mythology for some of his examples. And he is counting on an audience that would likewise be familiar with these classical stories. Otherwise, why would they be persuaded by them? Okay? So, then we have a very, very famous work. The Novum Organum. This has to do with a whole new approach to and assembly of knowledge, or a whole new system of knowledge and of knowing. And here he's not going to talk about the best ways to arrive at the truth. He's going to approach the problem from the other way around. He's going to be approaching the impediments to true knowledge. Those things that can prevent us from ever acquiring true knowledge. He calls these the idols. And here what he's doing is he's nodding toward what? What famous philosopher had talked about idols as being, at best, half-truths? Plato. Plato in the Republic. There are a couple of different times in the Republic when Plato is talking about knowledge and about what is valid knowledge and so forth. And he has his famous analogy of the cave, in which that is one of the images. Okay. So, first of all, we have the idols of the tribe, what he calls the idols of the tribe. And this is a tendency or proneness towards abstractions and generalizations, as if those abstractions and generalizations were the reality of what is being discussed. Think, for example, about discussions that degenerate into, well, you know what men are like, or you know how women are, and so forth. Those kinds of abstractions and generalizations are discussed often by people as if they were real, as if they were real, as if they conform to some reality beyond language. And of course, Bacon thinks that this is one of the principal impediments to knowledge. Okay? Then secondly, what he calls the idols of the cave. The idols of the cave. The cave, again, Plato's cave, but also with the sense of the cave being the place of who? Primitive peoples. So that first it was the idols of the tribe. Now it's the idols of the cave. Well, okay. Falling in love with one's own ideas, theories, sciences, so that one distorts the facts to fit these, what he calls fancies. Things that you fancy, which are not really true necessarily, but you're so attracted by your own ideas that you distort facts in order to fit them. What's a common instance in our time of what Bacon is discussing here? Can you think of an example? Anybody think of an example? Yeah, did you have an example? Okay.
The weapons of mass destruction?
Well, what can I say? Notice that what we sometimes call putting a spin on something, politicians do this. Your example may be a very good one here. Politicians often do this. You know, certain events will occur, and then people who have a stake in interpreting things a particular way, because they're ideologically committed to a certain view, will try to spin things in such a way that they will seem to confirm their own ideological biases, rather than recognize that whatever has occurred or not occurred really undermines and therefore should require a revising of their thinking. Okay? So those are the idols of the cave. Then we have the idols of the marketplace, what he calls the idols of the marketplace. Language, words, used to create or shape reality based on the mistaken view that words can grasp and control reality. We always have to be suspicious, according to Bacon, about the way in which we formulate things in words. Because the words will never fully capture whatever the reality is. Okay? And once again, we get back to that question of having mental reservations about things, not just accepting things too quickly or too easily. Okay? Asking questions, constantly asking questions. And then finally we have what he calls the idols of the theater. And here he's not talking about theater in our sense of theater. This is the love of systems, what later in the 19th and 20th centuries would be called ideologies, which are the mere plays of philosophical theater. Now, why does he use the metaphor of philosophical theater here? Why theater? Well, one of the most ancient discussions about theater and about drama is that what is put on the stage is not ultimately the real thing, is it? But you have people playing out certain kinds of roles. Well, what if you extend the metaphor to thinkers? And you say, well, what if thinkers are simply playing out certain roles? And here's somebody who's a Cartesian, and there's somebody who's a Kantian, and somebody else is a Lockean, and somebody else is a Hegelian or whatever. And they are simply playing out certain kinds of roles according to already conceived systems. And this becomes a kind of game rather than a genuine search for truth. Okay, let's go back to the idols of the tribe. And in your textbook, this is under Novum Organum. You have, first of all, the idols. And then look at the idols of the tribe. That's the second paragraph there. The human understanding is of its own nature prone to abstractions and gives a substance and reality to things which are fleeting. But to resolve nature into abstractions is less to our purpose than to dissect her into parts, as did the school of Democritus, again an appeal to classical antiquity, which went further into nature than the rest. Matter rather than form should be the object of our attention. Its configuration and changes of configuration and simple action, the law of action or motion. For forms are figments of the human mind, unless you will call those laws of action forms. What he's really said, to translate that, is that if you look at the world in terms of ideas that you already have made up, which you think constitute the forms of reality, you're going about your search the wrong way. What you should do is begin with looking at matter, looking at physical reality, dividing it up in ways that methodologically and conceptually make sense and will be productive for research, rather than simply jumping to conclusions and letting your preconceived ideas and your tendency to want to believe in those preconceived ideas cloud your thinking and impede your research toward the truth.